July 1943. The Tunisian desert. The air tastes like copper and diesel. Dust hangs in sheets across the valley floor, kicked up by retreating columns and the percussive thud of distant artillery. The sun is a white furnace overhead, turning metal too hot to touch, baking the sand until it shimmers like water. Beside a scorched ridgeline, a British Crusader tank sits motionless. Its tracks are half buried in the sand. Smoke curls lazily from the engine compartment. The crew stands nearby, helmets off, faces blackened with soot and exhaustion. They watch the horizon. They know what's coming. One man doesn't look up. He's on his back beneath the tank, wedged into the shadow between the hull and the burning ground. His name is Sergeant Thomas "Mad Tom" Wilkes. His uniform is soaked through. His hands are wrapped in oil-stained rags. In one hand, a wrench. In the other, a piece of steel scavenged from a destroyed half-track 2 miles back. The crew has already written off the tank. Command has already written off the crew. But Wilkes is still working. Around him, the war continues. Engines growl in the distance. The radio crackles with frantic voices. Somewhere to the east, German reconnaissance units are closing in. And beneath a dead tank in 120-degree heat, a mechanic refuses to stop. By the summer of 1943, the North African campaign had become a graveyard of steel. Thousands of tanks, British, American, German, Italian, lay scattered across the desert, their hulls split open, their crews gone. Some had been destroyed by enemy fire. Others had simply stopped working. Tank warfare in the Second World War was not the clean, decisive clash of armor that propaganda films suggested. It was a logistical nightmare. For every tank lost in combat, 2 more broke down from mechanical failure. Engines seized in the heat. Transmissions shattered under the strain of sand and weight. Fuel lines clogged. Tracks snapped. In the desert, a tank was only as good as the supply line behind it, and supply lines were fragile, overstretched and constantly under attack. The British Army's Crusader tank was a perfect example of this brutal reality. Designed for speed and maneuverability, it was intended to outflank and harass heavier German panzers. On paper, it was a cavalry tank, a modern charger. In practice, it was a maintenance disaster. Its engines overheated. Its cooling systems failed. Its Christie suspension, brilliant in theory, broke down constantly in sand and rough terrain. Crews called it the Widowmaker, not because it was dangerous to the enemy, but because it was dangerous to them. And yet, the Crusader was what they had. In the summer of 1943, as the Allies prepared for the final push to drive Axis forces out of North Africa, every operational tank mattered. Every crew mattered. Every mile of mobility could mean the difference between holding a position or losing it. Enter the men who kept those tanks moving, the mechanics. They were not glamorous. They did not lead charges or storm hills. Their names rarely appeared in dispatches. But without them, the entire war machine ground to a halt. They worked in the open, under fire, in heat that could kill a man in hours. They worked with broken tools, improvised parts, and no margin for error. They worked because if they didn't, their friends died. Sergeant Thomas Wilkes was one of these men. Born in 1919 in the industrial town of Coventry, England, he grew up in the shadow of factories and foundries. His father was a machinist. His grandfather had worked the coal mines. Wilkes learned to fix things before he learned to read. By the age of 12, he could dismantle and rebuild a motorcycle engine. By 16, he was working in a motorworks, repairing tractors and lorries for local farms. When the war came, Wilkes enlisted in the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, the REM, the branch responsible for maintaining and recovering damaged vehicles. He was assigned to the 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, one of the most celebrated units in the British Army. His job was simple: keep the tanks moving. But simplicity in war is an illusion. The 7th Armored had been fighting in North Africa since 1940. By 1943 they had seen it all. Tobruk, El Alamein. The long, grinding pursuit across Libya and into Tunisia. They had learned to fight in sandstorms, to navigate by stars, to sleep in slit trenches with scorpions. They had learned to trust their mechanics more than their officers. And among those mechanics, Wilkes had earned a reputation. He was stubborn, obsessive, unwilling to accept defeat. If a tank could be saved, he would save it. If it couldn't, he would strip it for parts and use those parts to save another. He worked longer hours than anyone else. He took risks that made his superiors nervous. His fellow engineers called him Mad Tom, not as an insult but as a statement of fact. He was mad enough to believe that a tank wasn't dead until he said it was dead. By July 1943, the war in North Africa was reaching its final, desperate phase. The German and Italian forces, once seemingly invincible, were now trapped in a shrinking pocket in northern Tunisia. The Allies, British, American, Free French, were closing in from the west and south. The Mediterranean Sea lay to the north. There was no retreat, no resupply, no reinforcements. For the Axis, it was the beginning of the end. For the Allies, it was a chance to deliver a knockout blow before turning their attention to Europe. But victory was not guaranteed. The German Afrika Korps, though depleted and starving, was still dangerous. Their commanders, veterans of years of desert fighting, knew how to make the Allies bleed. They used the terrain. They set ambushes. They fought delaying actions with a ferocity born of desperation. Every ridge, every wadi, every dusty crossroads became a battlefield. The 7th Armored Division had been tasked with pushing east along a narrow corridor between two mountain ranges. Their objective was to cut off a key supply route and prevent German forces from consolidating their defenses. It was a straightforward mission. Move fast. Hit hard. Don't stop. But in the desert, nothing ever went according to plan. On the morning of July 14th, a squadron of Crusader tanks from the 7th Armored moved out at dawn. The plan was to cover 30 miles by midday, link up with American forces to the north, and trap a retreating German column. The tanks rolled out in a cloud of dust, their engines roaring, their crews tense but confident. Sergeant Wilkes traveled with them in a Matador recovery truck, along with 2 other mechanics and a pile of spare parts that never seemed adequate. His job was to follow the squadron, stay close, and be ready to fix whatever broke. In the desert, something always broke. By 0900 hours, the first tank had thrown a track. Wilkes and his team had it back in action within 40 minutes. By 10:30, another tank's engine overheated. They jury-rigged a coolant line using a piece of rubber hose and a tin can. By 1200, they were behind schedule, the heat was unbearable, and the radio chatter was getting frantic. That's when the lead tank, a Crusader commanded by Lieutenant Peter Ashford, rolled over a depression in the sand and heard a sound no tanker ever wanted to hear. A deep, grinding crack from inside the hull. The tank lurched. The engine sputtered. Then it died. Ashford's crew tried to restart it. Nothing. They checked the fuel. Full. They checked the electrics. Fine. The problem was deeper. Somewhere inside the transmission or drivetrain, something catastrophic had failed. Wilkes arrived on scene 10 minutes later. He climbed onto the hull, looked inside the engine compartment, listened to the crew's description of the failure. Then he crawled underneath. What he found made his stomach sink. The tank's final drive, a critical component that transferred power from the engine to the tracks, had sheared apart. It was a known weak point in the Crusader design, but it was also a part that required a workshop to replace. It required a crane, specialized tools, hours of labor. In the field, under fire, it was considered irreparable. Ashford stood beside the tank, arms crossed, staring at the eastern horizon. He could see dust rising in the distance. German reconnaissance maybe? Or a patrol. Either way, the squadron couldn't wait. Command had already radioed, if the tank couldn't move, abandon it. Rig it with explosives and move out. Wilkes crawled out from under the tank. His face was streaked with grease. His eyes were red from the dust. He looked at Ashford. I can fix it, he said. Ashford blinked. You what? I can fix it. Give me 2 hours. Ashford glanced at the horizon again. Tom, we don't have 2 hours. And even if we did, you don't have the parts. Wilkes didn't argue. He just turned, walked back to the recovery truck and started pulling tools out of the back. The crew exchanged looks. The other mechanics shook their heads. The squadron commander, a major named Kilpatrick, drove up in a scout car and demanded to know what the delay was. When Wilkes told him he was going to attempt a field repair, Kilpatrick laughed, not unkindly, but with the weary disbelief of a man who had seen 100 impossible promises in the desert. 2 hours, Sergeant, Kilpatrick said. After that, we blow it and leave. Wilkes nodded. He was already back under the tank. The sun climbed higher. The heat became suffocating. Somewhere to the east, the dust plumes grew closer. And beneath a broken Crusader, in the middle of a war, Thomas Wilkes began to work. To understand what Wilkes was attempting, you have to understand who he was. Not just a mechanic. Not just a soldier. Something more stubborn. Something that didn't know how to quit. His crewmates said he talked to the tanks. Not in the way a man talks to a dog, affectionately. But in the way a surgeon talks to a patient. Quietly, intently, as if listening for something beneath the surface. He believed machines had personalities. Quirks. He believed you could feel when something was about to fail, if you paid attention. He rarely smiled. rarely joked. He slept 4 hours a night if that. When other men played cards or wrote letters home, Wilkes would sit beside a tank with a cup of tea, running his hands over the armor, checking bolts, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. His fellow mechanics thought he was obsessed. His officers thought he was invaluable. His friends thought he was going to get himself killed. And maybe they were right. Because what Wilkes was about to attempt wasn't just difficult. It was borderline suicidal. The final drive on a Crusader tank was a beast of engineering. It sat at the rear of the hull, encased in thick steel, and its job was to take the rotational force from the engine and transfer it through a series of gears to the track sprockets. When it worked, the tank moved. When it failed, the tank became a 30-ton paperweight. Wilkes had seen final drive failures before. Usually they meant the end. The component was too complex, too integrated into the hull structure to replace in the field. Even in a depot with proper tools and a full crew, it could take days. But Wilkes wasn't planning to replace it. He was planning to rebuild it. The problem was a sheared pinion gear, a small toothed wheel that meshed with the larger ring gear. Under normal conditions, replacing it would require disassembling half the drivetrain. But Wilkes didn't have normal conditions. He didn't have the right parts. He didn't have a crane. What he did have was a piece of scrap steel from a destroyed German half-track, a cutting torch, a file, a hammer, and an idea that no sane engineer would ever consider. He was going to fabricate a replacement gear by hand. While Wilkes worked, the war didn't stop. The squadron had moved out, continuing east toward their objective. They left behind a single scout car with a radio operator and 2 riflemen to provide security. It wasn't much. If a German patrol stumbled onto them, they'd be overrun in minutes. The radio crackled constantly. Reports of enemy movement. Requests for updates. Orders to hurry. The squadron was engaging scattered resistance 5 miles ahead. They needed every gun they could get. Every delay meant more risk, more casualties. Ashford and his crew stood watch, scanning the horizon with binoculars. The heat made the air shimmer, turning distant hills into liquid mirages. Every shadow looked like a tank. Every sound could be an engine. The tank's gunner, a young corporal named Davies, sat on the turret with a rifle across his lap. "We should rig the charges," he said quietly. "We're sitting ducks out here." Ashford didn't answer. He just watched Wilkes work. The sergeant hadn't stopped moving. Hadn't looked up. Hadn't asked for help. He was in his own world, a world of metal and heat and impossible math. "He's not going to make it," Davies said. Ashford lit a cigarette. "Maybe not. But I'm not stopping him." What Wilkes did next would later be called either genius or madness depending on who you asked. He pulled the piece of scrap steel from the truck, a section of drive shaft from a German SD, KZ 251 half-track salvaged weeks earlier. It wasn't the right size. It wasn't the right shape. But it was hardened steel and that was what mattered. Using a cutting torch he cut a rough cylinder from the shaft. Then he began filing. By hand. In 120-degree heat. Shaping the steel, tooth by tooth, into something that resembled a pinion gear. It was absurd. Pinion gears were precision machined components, manufactured in factories with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. What Wilkes was doing was the equivalent of carving a watch with a stone. But he didn't have a choice. He worked for 90 minutes without stopping. His hands bled through the rags. Sweat dripped into his eyes. The file scraped and scraped, a rhythmic hiss that seemed to blend with the distant rumble of artillery. The crew watched in silence. Even Davies stopped complaining. When Wilkes finally crawled back under the tank to install the makeshift gear, no one said a word. They just listened. The clank of metal. The ratchet of a wrench. The occasional curse. Then nothing. A long, terrible silence. Ashford leaned down. "Tom?" Wilkes' voice came from beneath the hull, hoarse and cracked. "Try it." Ashford climbed into the driver's seat. He primed the engine. Pushed the starter. The engine coughed. Turned over. Roared to life. The crew stared. "Give it throttle," Wilkes shouted. Ashford eased the throttle forward. The tank shuddered. The tracks began to move. Slowly. Then faster. The Crusader rolled forward 10 feet, then 20, then stopped. "Reverse," Wilkes called. Ashford threw it into reverse. The tank rolled backward. Davies started laughing. Not a normal laugh. A high, disbelieving laugh. Ashford shut down the engine and climbed out. Wilkes was already standing beside the tank, wiping his hands. His face was gray with exhaustion. "It'll hold," Wilkes said. "Maybe 50 miles. Maybe less. Don't push it too hard." Ashford just stared at him. "How the hell did you?" "Get moving," Wilkes said. You're late. For the men in Ashford's crew, what they had just witnessed didn't feel real. Tank crews lived and died by their machines. They knew every sound, every vibration, every smell. They knew when something was wrong long before it broke. And they knew, everyone knew, that some failures couldn't be fixed. But Wilkes had just fixed the unfixable. Davies, the gunner, would later write in a letter home, "I saw a miracle today. Not the religious kind. The kind where a man refuses to accept reality and reality blinks first." The loader, a quiet Welshman named Price, simply shook Wilkes' hand. Said nothing. His eyes said everything. Even Ashford, a career officer who had seen 3 years of desert war, felt something shift. He had always respected mechanics. But this was different. This was a man who had willed a tank back to life through sheer bloody-mindedness. "You're coming with us," Ashford said. Wilkes shook his head. "I've got to stay with the recovery truck." "No. You're riding in the tank. If that gear fails, I want you there to fix it again." Wilkes hesitated. Then he nodded. He climbed onto the hull, settled into a position near the engine compartment and held on. The Crusader's engine roared. The tracks bit into the sand. And together they rolled east toward the sound of guns. What none of them knew was how close they had come to disaster. 3 miles to the southeast, a German reconnaissance patrol had been shadowing the Allied advance. They had spotted the disabled Crusader through binoculars. They had watched the crew standing idle. They had assumed correctly that the tank was broken. The patrol commander, a lieutenant named Eric Kohler, had radioed for support. If they could destroy or capture a British tank, even a disabled one, it would be a small victory in a campaign that offered none. But by the time the support arrived, a pair of Panzer IIIs and an infantry squad, the Crusader was gone. Only tracks in the sand remained. Kohler stood in the dust, staring at the empty ridgeline. He didn't understand. His intelligence reports said British tanks rarely recovered from mechanical failures in the field. The report said the Allies relied on depots, workshops, supply lines. But the sand told a different story. Tire marks, boot prints, oil stains, and the deep parallel gouges of a tank that had rolled away under its own power. Kohler climbed back into his command vehicle, his face troubled. He didn't report what he had seen. There was no point. No one would believe him. But he filed it away. Another reminder that the war was not going according to plan. The Crusader caught up with the squadron at 1,500 hours. By then the fighting had intensified. The 7th Armored had run headlong into a German delaying force. 3 Panzer IIIs, 2 anti-tank guns, and a company of infantry dug into a low ridge overlooking a dry riverbed. The Germans had chosen their position well. The ridge gave them elevation and clear fields of fire. The riverbed funneled the British tanks into a kill zone. 2 Crusaders were already burning. A third was immobilized, smoke pouring from its turret. The rest had pulled back behind a low rise, trading shots with the German guns but unable to advance. Ashford's tank rolled into position just as a German 50mm shell screamed overhead and detonated in the sand 50 meters behind them. "Where the hell have you been?" Kilpatrick's voice crackled over the radio. "Mechanical delay, sir," Ashford replied. "We're operational now." "Good. We need to flank them from the south. Can you move?" Ashford glanced back at Wilkes, who was crouched on the hull, one hand on the engine compartment. The sergeant gave a single nod. "Affirmative, sir. Go. And don't stop for anything." The Crusader surged forward, angling south, away from the main line of tanks. The plan was simple. Use speed and cover to swing around the German flank, get into their rear and force them to split their fire. It was a classic cavalry maneuver. It was also incredibly dangerous. As they moved, the makeshift gear that Wilkes had fabricated began to show its limits. The tank shuddered. A grinding noise echoed from the drivetrain. Ashford felt it through the controls, a hesitation, a stutter in the power delivery. "Tom," he called over the intercom. "Keep going," Wilkes said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were fixed on the engine compartment. He could hear it. The gear was slipping. Not failing yet. But close. They rolled through a shallow wadi, tracks churning through soft sand. The grinding got louder. "Tom? Keep going." A German machine gun opened up from the ridge, stitching the sand to their left. Tracers arced overhead like angry fireflies. The Crusader accelerated, engine screaming, the grinding now a constant metallic shriek. Wilkes pulled a wrench from his belt. Without thinking, without even planning, he leaned over the side of the hull and reached into the open engine compartment. The heat was staggering. His hand found the transmission housing, burning hot, vibrating so violently it felt like it might shake apart. And he hit it. 3 sharp blows with the wrench. Percussive maintenance. The oldest trick in the book. The grinding smooth. The shuddering stopped. "Whatever you just did," Ashford said, "do it again if you need to." They crested a low rise and emerged onto the German flank. The enemy position was 200 meters ahead, infantry in slit trenches, an anti-tank gun crew frantically trying to reposition their weapon, a Panzer III turning its turret toward them. "Fire!" Ashford shouted. The Crusaders' 6-pounder gun barked. The shell caught the Panzer just below the turret ring. No penetration, but the impact stunned the crew, buying precious seconds. The Crusader kept moving. Davies fired again. This time the shell punched through the Panzer's thinner side armor. Smoke billowed. The German tank lurched to a stop. Behind them, the rest of the squadron saw the opening and surged forward. The German line, now flanked and under fire from 2 directions, began to collapse. But Ashford's tank wasn't done. A second Panzer appeared, grinding up the slope from a hidden position. Its gun swung toward them. Ashford threw the Crusader into a hard turn. The tracks bit. The makeshift gear screamed in protest. And then it gave out. The tank lurched. The engine roared, but the power wasn't reaching the tracks. The Crusader rolled to a stop, broadside to the enemy tank. "Reverse! Reverse!" Davies screamed. Nothing. Wilkes was already moving. He grabbed a pry bar, a hammer, a spare section of chain. He didn't think. Didn't plan. He just acted. He dropped off the hull, rolled under the tank, and crawled into the impossibly tight space near the final drive. The air was choking. The smell of burning oil filled his lungs. The heat was so intense it felt like being inside an oven. He could hear the German tank's engine. Getting closer. His hands found the gear. It had slipped out of alignment. His improvised teeth couldn't hold under the strain of the hard turn. He jammed the pry bar into the housing, levered the gear back into position, and used the chain to lash it in place. It was crude. It wouldn't last. But it might hold for a few more seconds. "Try it now," he shouted. Ashford hit the throttle. The tracks caught. The Crusader lurched backward just as the German shell tore through the space they had occupied a heartbeat earlier. Wilkes didn't have time to climb back out. The tank was moving and he was still underneath it. He rolled, scrambled, pulled himself along the underside as the tracks churned beside him, kicking up sand and gravel that pelted his face like shrapnel. Then a hand grabbed his collar and hauled him upward. Price, the loader, had leaned out of the turret and pulled him onto the hull with a strength born of pure adrenaline. Wilkes collapsed onto the armor, coughing, bleeding, barely conscious. The Crusader kept moving. The German line broke. With their flank exposed and 2 of their tanks destroyed, the remaining Panzer and the infantry began a fighting withdrawal. They fell back through the ridges, firing as they went, but the momentum had shifted. The 7th Armored pressed forward, supported by artillery and air strikes that pounded the retreating enemy. By 16:30 hours, the ridge was secure. The squadron regrouped, counted losses, tended to wounded. 2 tanks destroyed. 1 immobilized. 7 men dead. 15 wounded. But the line had held. The objective had been taken. And the German supply route had been cut. Ashford's Crusader sat at the edge of the captured position, engine idling roughly, smoke leaking from a dozen places. The makeshift gear had finally given up completely. The tank could no longer move under its own power. But it had made it. Against every law of engineering and probability, it had made it. Wilkes sat on the ground beside the tank, his back against the tracks. His hands were wrapped in bandages. His face was a mask of dust and dried blood. A medic tried to examine him. Wilkes waved him away. Ashford walked over, carrying 2 canteens. He handed one to Wilkes and sat down beside him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. They just sat there, listening to the distant rumble of artillery, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon. "You saved us," Ashford said finally. Wilkes took a long drink of water. "I saved the tank." "Same thing." Wilkes looked at the Crusader. Its armor was scorched. Its tracks were half shredded. The makeshift repair had torn itself apart, and the final drive was now completely unsalvageable. But it had fought. It had moved when it should have been dead. It had carried its crew through hell and brought them out the other side. "Maybe," Wilkes said quietly. Major Kilpatrick appeared, boots crunching on the sand. He looked at Wilkes, then at the tank, then back at Wilkes. "Sergeant, I don't know what you did and I'm not sure I want to know. But I'm putting you in for a commendation." Wilkes shook his head. "No need, sir. It's not a request." Kilpatrick's voice was firm. What you did today kept 5 men alive and helped us take this position. That matters. He turned and walked away before Wilkes could argue. Davies climbed out of the turret and dropped down beside them. He was grinning, the kind of grin that only comes after surviving something you shouldn't have. "Mad, Tom," he said. "You're absolutely mad." Wilkes didn't smile. But something in his eyes softened. "Just a little." "Yeah," he said. "Probably." The sun dipped below the ridgeline. The desert cooled. The war for the moment was quiet. And in that brief window of peace, a broken tank and a stubborn mechanic became something more. A story. A legend. A reminder that sometimes in the chaos of war, the most extraordinary acts aren't performed by generals or heroes. They're performed by men who simply refuse to give up. By nightfall, the recovery crews arrived. They looked at Ashford's Crusader with a mixture of disbelief and professional admiration. When they examined the improvised repair, one of the senior mechanics, a warrant officer with 20 years of experience, just laughed. "Who did this?" he asked. Ashford pointed to Wilkes, who was asleep on the sand 30 meters away, too exhausted to even move. The warrant officer walked over, looked down at the sleeping sergeant and shook his head. "He shouldn't have been able to do that," he said. "It's not possible." "Well," Ashford replied, "he did it anyway." The warrant officer nodded slowly. Then he crouched down, carefully placed a cigarette and a box of matches beside Wilkes' hand and walked away. Some things didn't need words. The Crusader was towed back to the depot 2 days later. Engineers studied the makeshift gear, took photographs, wrote reports. Some recommended that Wilkes be disciplined for using unapproved methods. Others recommended that his technique be studied and potentially incorporated into field manuals. In the end, the reports were filed and forgotten. The war moved too fast for paperwork. But the story didn't disappear. It spread through the ranks of the 7th Armored. Then to other units. Then to the engineers and mechanics scattered across North Africa. It became a tale told in mess tents and workshops, exaggerated with each retelling, but always anchored by one undeniable truth. Mad Tom Wilkes had brought a dead tank back to life in the middle of a firefight, using nothing but scrap metal and sheer stubbornness. And in a war where machines failed and men died and nothing ever went according to plan, that mattered more than any medal. The immediate consequences of Wilkes' repair were felt most acutely by Ashford's crew. They had survived. That simple fact, so easy to overlook, was everything. In a war where tank crews had a life expectancy measured in weeks, survival was a victory in itself. But survival came with weight. Davies, the gunner, found himself unable to sleep for days after the battle. Not because of the combat, he had seen plenty of that. But because he kept replaying the moment the tank had stopped, broadside to the German Panzer, and how close they had come to being erased from existence. He kept thinking about Wilkes underneath the hull, working blind in the suffocating heat while enemy shells screamed overhead. "I don't think he even cared if he lived or died," Davies said one night, sitting beside a campfire. "I think he just cared about the tank." Price, the loader, disagreed. He cared. He just cared about something more. Ashford didn't join the conversation. But privately he wrote a letter to his wife, something he rarely did, and in it he described Wilkes not as a mechanic, but as the kind of man who holds the world together when everyone else has let go. The letter never reached her. It was lost when a supply convoy was ambushed 3 weeks later. But Ashford kept a copy in his notebook and it survived the war. Within days, other tank crews began requesting Wilkes by name. Commanders wanted him attached to their units. Mechanics wanted to learn from him. He became something rare in the military, an enlisted man whose reputation preceded him, whose skill was valued more than rank or protocol. Major Kilpatrick, true to his word, submitted a commendation. It worked its way up through the chain of command slowly, filtered through layers of bureaucracy and skepticism. Some officers dismissed it as exaggeration. Others questioned whether field repairs of that nature should even be encouraged. After all, if tanks could be fixed under fire, perhaps soldiers would take unnecessary risks. But a few, a very few, understood what had really happened. They understood that Wilkes hadn't just repaired a tank. He had demonstrated something far more important: adaptability, ingenuity under pressure, the ability to solve problems that manuals said were unsolvable. In August 1943, Wilkes was promoted to Warrant Officer Class 2. It came with a modest pay increase and virtually no change in duties. He continued doing exactly what he had always done: fixing tanks, training younger mechanics, and working hours that would have broken most men. He never mentioned the promotion. Never acknowledged the commendation. When other mechanics asked him about the Crusader repair, he would shrug and say, It needed fixing. So I fixed it. But his methods began to spread. Junior mechanics started carrying improvised tool kits, files, cutting torches, scrap metal, based on what Wilkes carried. Recovery crews started looking at damaged tanks differently, asking not, is it reparable? But, how can we make it reparable? The doctrine didn't change. The manuals didn't change. But the culture did. Slowly. Quietly. In the way that real change always happens, not from the top down but from the ground up. The war moved on. North Africa was secured by May 1943. The 7th Armored Division was pulled back to England to prepare for the invasion of Europe. Wilkes went with them. In the months leading up to D-Day, he trained new mechanics, inspected tanks fresh from the factories, and helped refine maintenance procedures for the coming campaign. He rarely spoke about the desert. When other veterans swapped stories, he would sit quietly, smoking, listening. If pressed, he would offer small details, the heat, the sand, the constant breakdowns, but never the heroics. One night, a young mechanic asked him if the stories were true, if he had really rebuilt a final drive gear by hand in the middle of a battle. Wilkes looked at him for a long time. Then he said, it wasn't the middle of a battle. The battle was 3 miles away. But the tank moved afterward? It moved. How? Wilkes stubbed out his cigarette. Because it had to. That was all he ever said about it. On June 6, 1944, Wilkes landed on Gold Beach as part of the second wave. The 7th Armored pushed inland through Normandy, fighting through hedgerows and shattered villages. The terrain was different. The enemy was different. But the problems were the same. Tanks broke down, parts were scarce, and the war didn't wait for anyone. Wilkes worked through it all. He kept the tanks moving. He trained others. He improvised, adapted, survived. In September 1944, during the advance into Belgium, Wilkes was injured by shrapnel from a mortar round. The wound wasn't severe. A piece of metal lodged in his shoulder, but it was enough to take him off the front line. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to England. He fought to return. Filed requests. Argued with doctors. But the injury had done nerve damage. His right hand, the hand that had shaped metal and turned wrenches and saved lives, no longer had full strength. In December 1944, he was medically discharged from active duty. For a man like Wilkes, it was a kind of death. He returned to Coventry. The city had been bombed repeatedly during the Blitz. Whole neighborhoods were gone. The factories where he had worked before the war were rubble. He found work at a motor repair shop, fixing civilian trucks and farm equipment. It was quiet, safe, soul-crushing. He never talked about the war. Never attended reunions. Never sought recognition. When the local newspaper tried to interview him about his service, he refused. But in 1947 he received a letter. It was from Lieutenant Ashford, now a civilian working as a schoolteacher in Sussex. The letter was long, thoughtful, and ended with a single line. I think of you every time I see a broken machine. You taught me that nothing is unfixable if you care enough. Thank you. Wilkes kept the letter. He never replied. In 1949, a military historian researching the North African campaign stumbled across Kilpatrick's commendation report. Intrigued, he tracked down members of Ashford's crew and interviewed them. The resulting article, published in a small military journal, was titled Field Repairs and the Human Element, a Case Study. It didn't use Wilkes' full name, just Sergeant T.W., but it described the Crusader repair in detail. It analyzed the improvisation, the risk, the impossible odds. It concluded with a recommendation that field repair training be expanded and that mechanics be given more latitude to improvise. A few officers read it. Fewer still took it seriously. The article was forgotten. But decades later, when the British Army revised its maintenance doctrine, elements of that case study, buried under layers of bureaucracy and time, found their way into training manuals. Not explicitly. Not as a direct citation. But as a philosophy: when standard procedures fail, adapt. When adaptation seems impossible, try anyway. Wilkes never knew. He lived quietly until 1983, when he died of heart failure at the age of 64. His obituary in the Coventry Telegraph was 3 sentences long. It mentioned his work at the motor shop. It mentioned his military service. It did not mention the Crusader. At his funeral there were 14 people. One of them was an old man in a worn suit who stood at the back and didn't speak to anyone. After the service, he placed a small metal gear, rusted, hand-filed, clearly improvised, on the grave. It was Peter Ashford. He had carried that gear for 40 years. He left without a word. There are no monuments to Thomas Wilkes. No statues. No plaques. His name does not appear in history books or documentaries. If you search for him, you will find almost nothing. And yet, his story echoes through the machinery of war in ways both subtle and profound. The Second World War was won not just by generals and soldiers, but by the countless men and women who kept the engines running, the weapons firing, the supply lines moving. They worked in the shadows of history, their contributions measured not in territory gained or battles won, but in the quiet persistence of simply making things work. Wilkes was one of them. A mechanic who refused to accept that a machine was beyond saving. A man who believed that with enough stubbornness, enough skill, and enough sheer bloody-minded determination, anything could be fixed. He was right. But more than that, he represented something essential about the human spirit in wartime. The refusal to surrender. The insistence that even in the face of impossible odds, even when logic and reason say to walk away, you keep trying. You keep fighting. You keep working. Because sometimes, that's all that stands between survival and annihilation. A man with a wrench, a piece of scrap metal, and the unshakable belief that it's not over until it's over. The Crusader tank that Wilkes saved no longer exists. It was scrapped decades ago, melted down, its steel repurposed. The men who crewed it are gone. The battlefield where it fought is now farmland, quiet and green. But the story remains. Passed down.